In this video, we're going to take a close look at sharpening, why nearly all images need some form of sharpening, and we'll look at the best ways to go about sharpening your images for the ultimate result. So let's get started. So when we said nearly all images need sharpening, there are some times when sharpening is not necessary for your image files. And let's have a look at a couple of options here. For instance, this image deliberately defocused for an artistic effect, sharpening is not going to help the image. Or in fact, this image where there was deliberate camera movement for an artistic effect, it's not going to make any difference. But for something like this, where you're aiming for a sharply defined, clear image, sharpening is vitally important. And we'll have a look at how we're going to achieve that, both in Lightroom with the raw processing and some techniques in Photoshop that you can apply to really enhance the sharpness of your images. The first question that most people ask is, why do we need to sharpen our photographs? Surely with modern sensors and lenses, our photographs are sharp enough. Well, the answer lies in how our cameras record the information that is used to make an image. And if we look at how that happens, our sensors in our cameras for the most part record only red, green or blue for each pixel. And then when the image file is read into something like Lightroom or another raw conversion software, values are added for the other channels for each pixel. And that is done by guesstimating or establishing the color values for each pixel based on the surrounding values. And at areas of difference of tone and of color, you get a little bit of softness introduced because the software is guessing what the color value should be. So all images need a little bit of sharpening, and that's best handled initially in the raw processing part of the workflow, and then we will show you some techniques for applying additional sharpening creatively in Photoshop for the ultimate result. Let's first look at applying sharpening in Lightroom as we've brought in our raw file and converted it to a viewable image. Now if we move on into the develop module, let's have a look at this photograph. This was taken with a Sony APS-C camera exposed at ISO 1600 because the lighting was very poor, and you can see that while the image is well focused, if we zoom right in and we go to the unprocessed file, you'll see that there's quite a lot of noise and there's a little bit of lack of sharpness. Now one thing that's important to remember is when you're sharpening an image, you need to also deal with noise reduction if you've been shooting at high ISO. And if we move across to a second version of this file that I've made and applied sharpening and noise reduction, you'll see that there is quite a difference. If I then turn the actual sharpening and noise reduction off, you'll see that's how the image would be without anything applied. When you bring an image into Lightroom, it will have a certain number of settings applied, which you'll normally find to be a sharpening value of 40. Now that's just an arbitrary value that's assigned by Lightroom, and you'll also see that no noise reduction has been applied, even though this is quite a high ISO image and is quite noisy. So if we move back to the other copy that I have, and if we turn the noise reduction off entirely, you'll see that the default values reduce the noise somewhat, but by applying a reasonable amount of sharpening and also noise reduction to the file, you can mitigate a lot of those effects. And if you are looking at an image that has a lot of fine detail, you can really refine the amount of detail in the image, but bearing in mind that we use the masking tool to apply that sharpening only to the edges of tonal values. So if you hold down the Alt key and move that masking slider, you'll see that without any masking applied, the sharpening is applied right across the image and can introduce some unwanted artifacts. So what you want to do is you want to apply this sharpening, but then limit its effect to just the edges of tonal values, because the sharpening does not replace focus in an image. All it does is increase the contrast at the edges of tone or color, and that's what we want to achieve. And then you will see this one has the noise reduction set at 36. If we take it all back to 0, you'll see that there's quite a lot of noise in this image, and we can then move it up until we get an acceptable result. and ideally you want to keep that detail level as high as possible to retain as much detail. And so applying noise reduction in the initial image processing step in Lightroom is essential to get the image somewhere near it needs to be. Once we've done this, we can also apply some other work in the texture and clarity part of the processing in the basic panel, and applying a texture amount increases the detail or contrast in the very fine detailed areas, and the clarity increases contrast in the larger tonal value areas. If we take this back out to full view, you will see that the image looks fine when it fits into the viewfinder, but when you zoom in you start to see some issues. But in this case we've applied sufficient sharpening to get us to a value that's going to be acceptable, and then we can apply further sharpening and refinement in Photoshop. Before we move into Photoshop, let's have a look at another couple of images in the Lightroom catalogue that we can use as examples. Now, I have an image here taken of a gorilla at Taronga Zoo, taken with a 600mm lens, handheld under very challenging lighting conditions. You can see that the ISO on this image was 8000 ISO. It was taken with a Nikon D850 camera, and we can see here's the image at its default value, and you can see that yes, there's quite a lot of noise there. It is pretty well focused, but there is another little bit of an issue in that there is a slight amount of movement, very slight, but there is a slight amount of movement in the image, and we'll show you how we can correct that once we move into Photoshop. But if we then have a look at this image after we've applied some sharpening and noise reduction, you'll see that the image is improved somewhat, but not to perfection. That's without any noise reduction or sharpening applied at all, and applying the appropriate amount in Lightroom gets us part way towards where we want to be. And let's look at another image here, which is a Photoshop file that we have used with low ISO, mounted on a tripod, critically focused, and yet there is still scope for sharpening. We'll have a look at that one once we move into Photoshop, but let's go back now to that original image and have a look at it in Photoshop. Once we've applied the appropriate amount of sharpening in Lightroom, we can then export the image into Photoshop for further work. And once we've rendered the image into an RGB pixel-based file from Lightroom, we can't do as much as we can with that initial raw setting. So doing the initial sharpening and noise reduction in Lightroom or your chosen raw conversion software is critical, because once you take noise and other issues into Photoshop, it's very hard to undo them. So let's move across into Photoshop now, and let's have a look at that image that we looked at. Now I've prepared this a little differently by applying different settings on different layers. So let's just zoom in now, and let's zoom into 50% so that we can see how the effect works on these images. Now, the very first layer I have open here is the file with no sharpening or noise reduction applied, and if I zoom in to 100%, you can see what we saw earlier. It's pretty horrible. Let's just zoom back out to 50%, and the file with the noise reduction and sharpening applied in Lightroom, even at 50%, you can see a slight difference. You can see that all this graininess disappears, and we've got a much smoother looking image with smoother transitions between colors and edges. But we're not finished yet. We can apply a lot more sharpening, and we can refine this image even more. Just remembering that if the image is not focused properly, no amount of sharpening is going to solve your problem. So you need to start with an image that's correctly focused at the outset. And one tool that I've found to be really useful is Topaz Denoise. Now, right up front, I can say that I do not receive any funding or sponsorship from Topaz or anyone else, but I've found that this piece of software works particularly well for reducing noise and also sharpening. I've also used Topaz Sharpen AI, and I found the results from that to be a little less rewarding, And so my go-to step next would be to go to Topaz Denoise, and it will open the file in Denoise, and I'll show you how that works. For the purposes of demonstration, I've made a copy of that file that was sharpened in Lightroom and had noise reduction applied, and with the Topaz software installed you can access it directly from your filters menu. Topaz Denoise AI is my go-to package for further refining the image, and we'll pop back in a sec once I have that window open. We now have Topaz Denoise open, and it opens in a new window. You'll see here that I've got the split view, and with the image file open some default settings have been applied, and on the left hand side of this dividing line is the image before Topaz has applied its settings, and on the right hand side after the settings have been applied. And you can see here that I've selected Denoise AI as the preferred option. There are two further options within the software, and we're looking at a 100% or one-to-one preview of just a part of the image. And we have some sliders here, one for reducing the amount of noise in the image, and each time you move one of these sliders the image will generate a preview, and this can, depending on the power of your processing software, can take a little bit of time. Generally I find that a setting of around 15 or so is a good starting off point, but we're doing two things. We're reducing the noise, but we want to retain the sharpness in the image. Now by default it seems to sit at around 15, but I find somewhere between 25 and 30 is a good option for most images, depending on how much noise there is. And once we've again applied a setting and adjusted it, it will regenerate the preview. And also I want to keep as much original detail as possible. Again, somewhere between 25 and 30 is the amount that seems to work best for my style of images. You can find your own settings and decide for yourself. Now if we just have a look now, this is the image as it came in, and that's with the Lightroom noise reduction and sharpening applied. You can see that particularly in here it's a little bit gritty and grainy, but with the Topaz working its magic, it's really smoothed out a lot of that detail, and yet still seems to retain a lot of the original detail. And again, by manipulating these sliders you will find that you'll get a setting that works for you. Once you're happy with these settings you can click on apply. Now, word of caution here, depending on your computer's processing power, this may take quite a while to process, maybe 2 or 3 minutes or up to 5 minutes, and if you're using the Sharpen AI program it takes even longer to process. So we're going to click on apply here, and then we won't sit and watch it process. We'll come back and look at it once it's finished and pop back into Photoshop. Now Topaz has finished working its magic, and we've popped back into Photoshop, and we have a separate layer here that I've saved just to show the difference. Now if I turn this layer on and we zoom into 100%, we can really see the difference. This is at 100% with the Topaz Denoise added to the Lightroom sharpening, and you will see particularly in this middle section it's certainly improved the image a little bit more. But then if we go back to the full screen view, we can really see this image is starting to come to life. But there are a few more techniques we can apply that give the appearance of further sharpening, but which actually just apply a little further contrast in selected areas, and we're going to look at that next. In part 2 of this video we'll look at creative sharpening and extra steps we can apply in Photoshop. So come back and have a look at part 2 and we'll cover those steps then.